Ladies and gentlemen, it's been 2 weeks, and I know I'm one day late, but I did post about this before, so sorry about that. But we are here again with yet another patch note review. This time around, it is going to be for 0.79. Again, looking at the banner. No new characters this time, but this patch in and of itself, quite an interesting one. So join me as I talk about the patch notes here and what we are going to be dealing with for the next couple of weeks until 0.80. Of course, after the banner, we're going to be talking at how the patch changed thought and the direction in which how this patch is going to be done. This time, let's start off with a little bit in regards to the balance changes. They're going to be changing up how the balancing in and of itself will work a little bit. Of course, statistics-wise, we're going to go a little bit more towards the total pick rate of characters instead of divvying them up by the weapons. Kill rates are also going to be looked at a little bit differently due to the battle zones and the regular outside of battle zone kills. And another thing that we're going to be looking at here, a little bit more on the experimental side for 0.79, is that originally we led to a lot more nerfs than buffs when it came to characters. If characters were too strong, they tended to nerf them more so than buffing the weaker characters. And it seemed like this time around, at least for 0.79, we're going to see a little bit of a change as Nimble Neuron is going to try to help characters that have a little bit of a lower pick rate more so than the characters with the higher pick rate getting nerfed a little bit here. A couple of items being added on top of it, two Moonstone items. That means Meteorite's going to be a bit of a priority here for this patch. Spectre is going to be added, and Beautiful Garment. Of course, we will be talking about these two items later when we are talking about the armor pieces. This point here is going to be pretty important for 0.79 because a lot of the changes for both the augments as well as the game itself and even the character changes on top of it. This is really a big point that is going to stay consistent throughout the course of this patch notes review here. Of course, we'll talk about all that stuff when we're talking about all the other logistics when it comes to this patch, but keep this in mind because that's what we're going to be seeing a lot more in 0.79 compared to before, where fights were a little bit more sporadic as you wait for cooldowns back and forth. One last thing, we are still in Season 8. We're going to see a little bit more changes to the battle zones and the way that it operates. We will talk about this in just a moment here as we talk about some of the mechanical changes, but a big part is that these battle zones in and of itself are going to be a little bit more fast-paced, making sure that people have much more time to operate outside of the battle zones and try to prepare themselves a little bit into the days coming instead of spending their entire game, especially during these phases, inside of the battle zones in itself. As I just mentioned in the patch change thought process and the directions, we're going to be seeing a little bit of a mechanical change in regards to the times in which we do see preparation phases for the battle zones. Night 2 going to be increased, Night 3 also going to be increased, but we're also going to see a little bit of an increase to the duration of Night number 5 to adjust the amount of players going into the final zones, as in 0.78 there were so many characters going into the final zone that it seems like Nimble Neuron wants to try to control that a little bit through the way of increasing the duration of Night number 5 before we go into it. One last thing that's also going to be important really quickly for the mechanical changes. As of 0.79, the nerve gauge will naturally rise 25% faster in the battle zones, which means characters that wants to continuously try to keep their nerve gauge up by just continuously killing the bot over and over will have a little bit tougher time doing so. This should mean that the battle zones are going to end a little bit faster thanks to people being pressurized due to timer in and of itself of the battle zones being procced a lot faster than before. As for the augments in 0.79, we do have a lot of changes, but as I mentioned earlier, there is a common theme going around in 0.79, and we're going to see that throughout all of our augment changes here. Just to support a little bit more of that continuous fight, we're going to see buffs to cooldown all across the board here, just off the top of the screen. Of course, we can see Frenzy getting a massive buff on the cooldown, Frailty also getting a massive buff, just a little bit on the nerf side for the damage that it does itself, which isn't usually that big of a deal. You're more looking for the armor penetration or the armor shred on that part. Vampiric Bloodline will also see a cooldown buff there as well. Going to be consistent all across the board here. Fortification, support, going to be the same thing. But one big one that I wanted to mention here, Bitter Retribution getting a massive buff again. If you were there for the 0.78 video, I was also talking about Bitter Retribution, where that also got a buff during that patch. Or it might have been 0.77, whichever one of the two, that Bitter Retribution got a big buff on the damage as well as the cooldown buff on. It's going to be getting it here again. So a very, very viable augment, no matter what kind of situation you're in, whether you're looking for the damage or the sustainability, you will have it up a lot more often than before. And again, same thing for all of our other augments here. We'll be getting a small to a big cooldown buff in and of itself, again, to continuously support the continued battles over the course of time instead of spreading it out thin and sporadic as it was in 0.78. For 0.79, we're going to see a lot of character changes, but I talked about it earlier as well. It's going to be a very similar pattern of a lot of cooldowns being buffed to allow that continued fight gameplay that Nimble Neuron is looking for here in 0.79. But of course, it is a new patch, which means we will have some characters reducing in price. So if you've been looking for Leon, Mai, or Jenny, make sure you guys go pick them up while they do have the reduced price compared to before. First up, we're going to talk about Nikki here, just a little bit of a buff onto Guard in Reverse to reward players who decide to use it a lot more aggressively than using it to back away and try to kite people, more so than using it to go back in. Daniel is going to be one of our characters here. I'll talk about some characters that we do have this pattern showing up for, and then we'll just kind of skip through the rest. But as you can see here, cooldown is going to be nerfed here, buffed, I do apologize, in level 1, and then same thing for level 2, still 50-second cooldown for the last level, but that is a pretty low cooldown, so continued battle support, there it is. Same thing for Tia here as well, full rainbow, same idea, same concept, just on different characters. Laura's going to get a little bit of a mechanical adjustment here. Well, it's much more of a buff to make sure that she's a little bit more smoother in her gameplay. The range in which her passive will proc is going to be reduced so that it's a little bit easier for her to actually proc it against characters that do want to try running up straight into her to make sure that her damage is at least a little bit more consistent and smooth when you are going up against some of those matchups. Lennox has been played a lot recently too. Her win rate doing pretty alright if you look at the statistics, so she's going to get a little bit nerfed in regards to Blue Viper if you land both of the double hits. The true damage tick's going to do a bit less damage compared to before. Leon's just getting a bit of an attack power buff over on his end. Dual wield, the second auto attack for Rozzy, will be getting a little bit nerfed on her end. Lee Dailin going to be buffed on the attack speed per Nunchaku Mastery just to make sure that it's keeping up with the amount of attack speed that Glove has when you are doing these auto attack builds. Martina got hit pretty hard during 0.78, but this time around we're going to see a little bit of a buff in regards to how she actually gets her stacks. You are now able to get more stacks from capturing corpses compared to before, going from 46 here instead, just to make up for those 2 extra stacks that you do need to go for. And a bit of a buff over onto the cooldown of record in and of itself as well. But the problem is, I think Martina, still 12 stacks is a very, very tough kind of limit to reach as Martina, and you don't really have too much time in the game to actually get to that point with how fast other characters are snowballing with the pace of the game that Eternal Return is in right now in Season 8. So I think Martina's going to struggle a little bit here. She does need to adjust a little bit more into the current meta with the changes that she's received recently, but this is a definitely okay start for her to go from. Mai is going to be receiving a bit of an interesting changer. I think Mai has been still somewhat reliable when it comes to the damage, but they're going to be adjusting how her damage scaling actually works. Before, depending on how many pins you had, you got more damage based on your defense, but this time around they're going to remove that and adjust that to her base kit in and of itself to make sure that when you're actually using skills that require those pins, you're not going to get punished. For example, the E or the ultimate, you will not be getting punished for using those skills and deciding to lose some of those extra damage stacks that you're really looking for on Mai. Barbara will see some buffs over here as well, just a little bit of adjustments in regards to how our damage actually gets spread out. For example, on Free Electron Laser, we're going to see a bit of a nerf on the base damage there, but a bit of a buff over on the skill amplification scaling here instead, just to make sure that it fits in line with what Barbara actually wants to do with her builds. Bernice will also see a bit of a buff over here as well. Explosive Bola going to be getting lower cooldown, basically the same thing as before, but Foothold Trap also trying to reward players who decide to use this a little bit more on the offensive side of things. The only times this is really going to work out is if you're up against melee or if you land your ultimate on somebody and put a trap right underneath, so at least it's a little bit more damage compared to before, but it won't be too crazy in the long run. Bianca will be getting a bit of a buff in regards to smoothness of her gameplay. Same thing as a lot of other characters. The continuous battle is going to be beneficial for Bianca. And a huge change here for Celine. I don't know if you've been watching some clips that's been running around in the early days of 0.79 here, but her damage is absolutely ballistic. She has gone from a micro-intensive character to a character that just throws down a couple of bombs and presses the explode button, and then big funny damage is what ends up happening. So Celine, we will most likely see a bit of a hotfix nerf here in the next couple of days, but overall her damage has been ramped up massively to make up for the lack of the range that she lost thanks to 0.78, and the justification behind it is to let Celine actually do damage. And range decrease means that her objective control was definitely lessened, but her damage was slightly lacking, so Nimbudran buffed this character in this patch. Again, we will most likely see her being nerfed in the next couple of days, so we will have to see. Shukai going to be getting a buff here again for the Spear Mastery, more skill amp towards that character. Shoichi just a little bit more damage on those daggers flying out from his passive. Scylla getting a slight nerf in regards to the Play With Us. A whole 20 base damage, going to be nerfed a lot, especially towards the latter stages of the game. That is going to hurt her damage a bit, but it is still Scylla. Sylvia will also be seeing a bit of a buff here as well. Defense scaling per level going to be more, and shift gears, you're able to get off of your bike as soon as you get on it a lot faster compared to before. And as for Adela, we are going to see a slight buff over onto her damage here as well. Surprisingly low win rate. I did not expect that stat, but that is going to be a buff that comes through for Adela. And again, for Checkmate, similar things as before, consistent, continuous fighting support. Same thing for Adriana here as well. Very similar to what we just saw in Adela. We're going to see more damage on the Flamethrower and lower cooldown over onto the Cocktail Party. And Adina's is going to be a bit more focused towards her general gameplay to make sure that the skills that you typically don't use offensively will be used as a damaging source, just to reward characters and players that decide to use those skills a little bit more offensively than before. Assault Rifle for ISO going to be buffed here. Pretty standard, I think, from the past couple of patches. Aya's been buffed, ISO's been buffed when it comes to Assault Rifle. It's going to be happening here for ISO in 0.79. And for Isaac, we'll be seeing a bit of a buff over on his end to make sure that his gameplay style of going aggression with the Reinforce is going to be very much rewarded if you're able to land everything. And of course, same thing here again, continued fight support for Isaac as well. A very long-awaited buff for Alex. For some of those Alex players, of course, not biased on my end, just kidding. We do have some cooldown buffs coming through here. It means that the W, it is actually going to be scaling for the cooldowns, more so than being static throughout every single level of that skill. So going to be a pretty big change when it comes to the overall DPS on Alex's side. And the EMP Barrage will also be seeing a buff on the cooldown as well. Same thing. The entire change here for Alex, making sure that his continued fighting support is also an availability, more so than before. Yan will be seeing a bit of a change here as well, so some buffs over onto his damage. Plain and simple, that is going to be it for Yan. Estelle's is going to be a little bit more different here, where we're going to see a nerf onto this character. Her sustainability as well as the shield duration on her ultimate going to be nerfed. Aiden's damage overall going to get ramped up here as well. Same thing for Electrostatic Surge, more accessibility with the range buff as well as the cooldown buff. And for Ekion, just a little bit more damage for landing his E, so just dashing through people, you get more damage. A big change here for Elena. Much more utility, much more consistency in how that utility gets used. We're going to see a little bit more of an efficient way for her to actually stack her chill gauge as well as the damage that the freeze actually does. A huge buff onto that as well. So good things coming here for Elena. On top of it, more damage with skill amp never hurts a character. So cool things there for Elena players. And for Johan, more accessibility changes with his ultimate. Yuki going to be nerfed here a little bit to kind of tone him down after some of the buffs that he has gotten recently. And for Irem, she's been struggling a little bit according to the stats, so they will be buffing this character a little bit in regards to damage as well as the sustainability that this character has as a whole. Ava will also be a little bit more consistent when it comes to the amount of passive gauge that you do get, the VF, so that's going to be pretty cool there. More damage on the telekinesis auto attacks as well. Well, not auto attacks, sorry, the little beat that comes out, you will be able to see a little bit more of that as well. And for Leanne, just a bit more of that utilization. She's going to be a lot more smoother to play compared to before, a lot easier to play with your HP not getting consumed as much as before. And of course, your ghost form going to be a lot more effective now that the range of it is going to be 17 meters compared to 15 beforehand. Also, just as a side note, a huge buff over onto Leon players. Her voice line frequency has been adjusted, so you won't be hearing her voice as much often compared to before. So that's a nice thing that Nimble Neuron has also done for Leon players too. 11 going to be changed here a little bit too. Her win rate pretty low, so they're going to be buffing her especially towards the latter stages of the game. I think one of the bigger changes here that we do need to look at is going to be the food for thought duration change. They nerfed this a long time ago, and it is going to be reverted slightly just to help this character a little bit more, going from 1.6 seconds to 1.8 seconds as the enhanced taunt duration. Definitely going to be helping out in team modes or even when you're running crit auto attack version of the 11. So here, just a little bit of a damage nerf over on this Q, and for Jenny, we are going to see a little bit more of the changes that we've been seeing recently to the battle zones, where the drones aren't really going to affect the individual kits of certain characters, and that's going to be the case here for Jenny. Cooldown resets not going to be coming through from hitting those drones instead, which would be very strong if it still was in the game. Camillo is a bit of a problem character in 0.79. There's been clips going around where this change here, you mix up between Olay as well as Sierra, getting cooldown reductions from using your passive and your Vuelta back and forth interchangeably. This has been a bit of a problem. We're seeing Camillo's dash all over the place with W, just doing damage over and over and over again. So this is another character I will definitely expect some nerfs coming through very soon for the hotfixes, but it is a change that we do end up seeing here. You are able to rotate through skills a lot more faster compared to before. Carla, same thing for 0.79 and similar pattern with cooldown buffs. And for Kathy, she'll be getting a lot more damage buffs as well as a little bit of a buff to people who aren't able to land the outer range damage on the amputation, just to make sure that she's able to hold her own up against characters that want to go into melee range against her. Kara is going to be seeing a bit of a buff here over on her amp playstyle as well, just the damage straight up from the skill amp per rapier mastery, as well as Plague itself also doing some mastery too. So cool things there over on the amp Kiara side of things. Tazia going to be buffed a little bit over here as well. Of course, more consistency again for this character on top of everything else. So yet another character that will be getting buffed here for 0.79. And Theodore, the exact same thing, just more consistency with lower cooldowns. Felix going to be getting a small buff here with the attack power, and for Fiora, we've been seeing a lot of different Fiora change-ups nowadays in regards to how she wants to play out some of these fights. We will be seeing a bit more of that here in this patch as well, but it's going to be a bit more on making sure that her passive procs are a lot more effective when you do proc it with some of these certain skills. So Fiora players have been having to interchangeably kind of adjust their gameplay in the past couple of patches, and this patch again will reward characters and players that are able to adjust into the meta for 0.79. Piolo, more damage on his ult. Try to land it as much as possible instead of using it to get away. And for Hayes, this is a big change in 0.79. She's going to get compensated with buffs on damage for this, but this is a really, really big change in regards to the utilization of Hayes. Before, when you use your ultimate and she swings around like this, if you're in melee range of her, you got knocked back, but now you won't get knocked back anymore. You will instead be slowed by 50% for 0.6 seconds. Now, Hayes is a character that definitely had a lot of crowd control before, but I feel like she's going to struggle a little bit more up against some melee characters thanks to this, because just having shotgun, in my opinion, it is good. It's definitely a good crowd control source, especially up against melee characters, but the slow 50% for 0.6 seconds, not too long when you're already dealing with some characters that are going to be in that range if you're popping that rocket launcher. We'll see how this goes, although hopefully this character still stays alive, because Hayes is still a very fun character to watch and also match up into depending on what kind of character you are playing. Hyunwoo will be nerfed a little bit here as well. Actually might be buffed. I apologize, I read the numbers wrong, but it is going to be a passive damage buff over on the scaling, as well as Stomping Foot, going to be seeing a bit of a buff there as well. And last but not least, Hyejin, her W, will be seeing a bit of a buff over on the early stages of the game, and even towards the later stages as well. But you can see 4 seconds at level 1 and 2 seconds at level 5. Just a little bit more on the consistency side, you can use it without getting punished as heavily if you're trying to use it up against animals. And those are all the character changes. Of course, again, in 0.79, there was definitely a lot of changes that we saw, but very, very, the consistent pattern with the continued fighting support being added for a lot of characters with lowering cooldowns and all that jazz. So, cool changes. Again, consistent theme, which is theoretically good, and we'll see how that goes in 0.79. So let's talk about the weapons next. We're gonna see a couple of changes. Most of them are gonna be some of those standard buff and nerf simple ones where we do see increases or decreases in stat. There's a couple of items that I do want to talk about, so let's kind of skip through most of the simple ones and then we'll talk about the important ones here. First for glove, simple change there for Buddha's Palm, a buff. Mount Slicer getting buffed. Highlander Dirk getting buffed. B-Max will get buffed there as well. Missile Team nerf. Eye of Argos going to get buffed. And Meteor Claimer going to be buffed here as well. Peacebringer going to be buffed. And for Statue of Soteria, one of the few items that I do want to talk about here, we're going to see a bit of an overhaul in regards to how this item works. It is not going to be a scaling item anymore. It's just going to be a pure powerhouse that is going to be that item, and I think this kind of comes through as Mallet has been much more viable than Statue of Soteria in recent times. This item almost has next to no pick rate thanks to just Mallet being so good on these basic attack based characters. So we're going to see a ton of attack power, just making sure that Statue of Soteria is going to be that solid item choice if you do want that early game scaling, and make sure that you want to try to scale into something else by transitioning your weapon later on. Vajra will see a bit of a buff, Ghost Hand will see a little bit of a buff, Sharanga will see a nerf, both on the utility of it as well as the attack power. And another item that I do want to talk about here, Fuma is going to be getting nerfed pretty majorly. The max cooldown reduction of 5% that you do get just by building that weapon is going to be removed, which is absolutely huge here because it's one of the very few ways that you can get this stat alone without having to opt to go for some of those transitions like the Tindalos Monarch. So very big hit for some Shuriken players. I would assume something like Zahir will be struggling. Emmas, if they still want to go for the Fumas, they will definitely be struggling in this patch thanks to this nerf. Flechette, a small nerf, and last but not least, my last item that I do want to talk about in specific, Spear of Longinus will be getting a bit of a power adjustment. Attack power getting nerfed here for that item, but then it'll be also receiving a lot of attack speed here, which I think more or less either offsets or actually more benefits Spear of Longinus, because sometimes having raw attack power doesn't help if you don't have ways to actually dish out the damage that you do get from that stat. So I think this helps in the long run people who do want to run Spear of Longinus more than it hurts them. A small nerf over onto Bloody Ninetails. Windrunner will be seeing a bit of a power adjustment as well. And for Bow, last but not least, Argy will be seeing a bit of a big hit here. 6-hole skill lamp coming through. But this was also mentioned before during the Hedging part, where we are going to see that Bow getting nerfed a little bit here. Still a pretty strong weapon when it comes down to it. So a whole 6 skill lamp going to be removed off of it. Next up for the items, we're going to talk about some of the armor changes. There's a couple of new items that I want to talk about, so let's go through some of these other changes pretty quickly here. A couple of chest items going to be buffed as well as changed. Cardinal robes nerfed. Optical camouflage suit nerfed, but this is in preparation for another item that we're going to be talking about here in just a moment. Rocker's jacket is going to get buffed. Covert agent uniform going to be buffed. Dragon Dobok is going to get a little bit of an adjustment here, much easier to build, which is something that we have been seeing as of recently, simplifying those build recipes down to make sure that it doesn't take too long to build up into those. But to compensate for that, we are going to see a slight nerf over on the cooldown reduction. Butler suit will be buffed here just a little bit as well. And our first new item of 0.79 Spectre is going to come through, as we are going to see optical camouflage suit upgrade with the Moonstone. Just more stats, something pretty similar that we've been seeing compared to some of the other items where you just directly transition a gear into that one. And this time, just more critical strike chance, more attack power, but also giving a bit more skill damage reduction on top of everything else that you get. The other new item that we are going to be getting here is going to be Beautiful Garment, a good transition for auto attack based characters that really don't want to heavily prioritize in towards crit. As you can see, 20 attack power, a ton of attack speed, as well as some additional SP regen coming through for people who do decide to go for a beautiful garment. And again, it is going to be another moonstone item, so a very heavy prioritization on that meteorite if people do want to experiment on some of these chess pieces that Nimble Neuron is adding during this patch. Holy Orders, a slight nerf. Elegant Gown going to be seeing a slight buff, and a lot of other small changes over on the head, but the big one coming through is going to be Chinese Opera Mask. Completely hovering over what this item wants to do. We're going to see most of its damaging stats gone as the attack power is going to be removed. The skill amplification also going to be removed, but we will see armor penetration coming through here instead. So a very specific item that this item is going to be based around instead of being a bit more generalized and a lot more universal like it was during 0.78. Couple of arm changes as well, nothing too big. Sword Stopper changes, Corrupting Touch, Centipede's Pauldron, and the Mithril Shield. For the legs, something very similar, nothing too crazy of changes to note, except for Hermes getting a bit of a tenacity buff there. A lot of people opting to stick onto the Mavericks instead of transitioning over onto Boots of Hermes, so that additional tenacity might be the reason that you do want to go for that instead of sticking with the much more offensive version with the Mavericks. And as for accessories, nothing too crazy here as well. We are going to see some of those active item changes in regards to the stats alone, as well as the cooldown to again reflect the continued fighting support that Nimble Neuron does want to go for. Other than Hero's Record, we are actually going to see the Omnivamp increase going from 15% to 18%. The pick rate on Hero's Record, as far as I know, is not that high either. A little bit too much of a risky item to go for, especially when you're talking about ranked or even competitive side of things as well. So a bit of a reward if you do decide to go for it, but I still think this item is a little bit on the riskier side. We will have to see during 0.79. Just a quick miscellaneous change that I'm going to be talking about here. If you were remembering earlier from some of the system changes, you may have seen that I kind of skipped over this part, but MMR adjustments. There's been a little bit of talk on the Korean side of things just with how matchmaking and LP gains slash losses over on the teams, or I should say the duos and the squads queue. So I believe, this is again just my opinion at this point, don't quote me on this in the future, just to try hitting that. A lot of people were worried that this is straight up saying we're not going to let you queue up with people in your equal ranks as long as you're high ranks to kind of force people into solo queuing for team modes. But in my opinion, that would hurt especially the competitive side more of this game, since it doesn't really let you queue up with your teammates. So I think that's a bit of a confusing way to change or at least hit the specific issue that has been prominent in 0.78. I don't know if that's necessarily going to come all the way through, but again, I do not know. That's just me thinking that that is what it's trying to hit more so than what a lot of people are fearing about, which I'm also fearing about as well, so I'm hoping that it doesn't come through. And with 0.79, of course, it is a new patch during Season 8, which means we're going to get a couple of skins. First up, Special Task Force Theodore will be coming out. Just a little bit of a reskinned version of the Theodore with a bit of the camouflage suit on top of him. So if you do want to pick the skin up, absolutely go for it. But the one I do really want to talk about is going to be the Wilson Bakery Cecilia, our next epic skin to be added into this game. And this is also going to be coming up alongside the bakery that is going to be opening up in Korea. So if you are a Korean viewer, make sure you guys go drop by that event as long as it's still open. Make sure you guys can take advantage of that opportunity if you still can. So two really cool skins coming through, although I think the Bakery Cecilia skin just personally way better than the Theodore one. I'm sorry, Theodore players. And that's going to be it for patch 0.79. Wow, I mean, what a wild ride. Now, I posted about this on Twitter as well when I read over this during the evening that the patch notes actually released. But this is one of those patches where I just kind of sat down, I took the time to read it, and I was like, what the heck is this patch? It is not even in a bad way as well. At least on the bright side, there is that consistency with making sure that the continued fighting is supported. We can see a lot of those changes by the augment changes, as well as the day and night cycle changes, and even more changes onto the characters as well. So at least the consistency in regards to that was there. But a lot of very confusing changes on top of it on this patch, and I think my opinion is kind of shared among some of the people who do like to kind of analyze some of these patches. Of course, we do have our problematic cases, as you guys saw with the Camillo as well as the Celine. That is probably going to get fixed out very soon through hotfixes, since that is a little bit too difficult to kind of keep in the game and make sure that it is considered quote unquote balanced. So I'm not entirely sure what I think about this patch. It's something that, of course, we're going to have to keep an eye out on as the patch itself goes. I just don't know if I can give this a fair rating as of right now, since I am just still kind of baffled at how this patch is really going to come together in 0.79. So I don't know if I want to give this a rating as of right now. Maybe I can give a little bit of an update down in the comments below or something like that as the patch itself goes on. But for right now, I do apologize. I cannot give a rating on this one. But of course, what I say doesn't really matter. What really matters is what you guys think about this patch. So make sure you guys let me know down in the comments below what you guys think about patch 0.79. I'll include the link to this patch notes down there as well. So if you want to take a look at it for yourself, since I did skip over a couple of additional changes that I usually tend to skip over, make sure you guys go check that post out as well. But other than that, I will see you guys later. Thank you guys so much for watching this patch notes review, and I will see you guys in the next one for the big 0.80. Have a good one.